just full of great pictures and memories, and they're very kind to everyone they write about. It's very fine. It'll be a little different than usual, and Bert will go into the book and the making of the book, and he will be donating a copy to this library and also to Capitola Historical Museum. So I want to thank Jerry Zabalas for lending the library her copy of the book. This is her copy. And for letting us know all about the Izants and about the book. I tried to find it in Bookshop Santa Cruz. I looked it up online. I did everything to try to find it. I couldn't find it because it was a personal publication event. And so fortunately, Jerry told us about it and told us that she thought a lot of you would like to be here and hear them. So they are allowed to go on as long as they wish and to talk with you as long as you wish to stay. There are no time limits on today's session.
It's good to be here. I never envisioned that there would be so many people and so many that I recognize and a few that I didn't, that I'm reacquainted with. When I wrote this book that Beth showed you, I had just 200 copies printed, almost all of which I've given away to family and friends. There are several people here in this room that I have seen frequently over the years, Adele, Jerry, Rick Paretto, that I sent copies to. So unfortunately I don't have copies here that I can give to everybody. I wish I did, but I don't. But there will be a copy of the library, or those of you that know people I just mentioned, you might borrow their copy. I think Carolyn already borrowed a copy from her brother that I sent to. You know, it's good to be back in this library. I was here many times when I was a kid at Soquel Elementary. My recollection was that the main desk sort of sat out here in the middle, and there was a kind of a sweet elderly woman that was there. At least that's my remembrance. But what I came here for was to read books on baseball. I read every book that this library had on baseball, and I think I was consumed by baseball in the between the years of about 6 or 7 and 12, where I kind of peaked out. So I remember those books, and they were right over there. And that's where they were, in that corner.
They still are.
I would come in, and I would go over, and I would grab those old books on baseball, and I would read them, and I knew who won the pennant in 1912, and all that kind of thing. Even today, I can remember who won the pennant in the World Series up until about 1960. But he asked me who won the pennant 3 years ago, and I had no idea. About the cover on this book. Shortly after my wife and I were married, Sue painted 3 large canvases, 3 feet by 6 feet, depicting the northerly view from our house in the East Bay Hills across Claremont Canyon. And those paintings are kind of on the same order as we go up the main stairway in our house. So I always thought that they would be a fitting cover for the book, and so that's what that's about. So what I'm going to do is to read a short statement from the book jacket that my publisher wrote, and then I'll read part of my preface, and then I'll read several sections from the book, short in some cases, that I think might be of particular interest to you Soquelites. And halfway through my reading of about 8 or 9 sections, my brother Dave will read an essay that I think captures the spirit and camaraderie that Dave, along with Rick and other Soquelites of the mid-50s shared. So as I said, I first would read this section that my publisher, Fred Fawcett at Minuteman Press in Berkeley, wrote. Inspired by 2 writings of his parents while they were students at the University of California at Berkeley in 1922 and 1923, one of their sons, Bertram C. Izant, has written this book, Writings Memories, in 12 chapters containing over 120 sections, many accompanied with documents and photographs. the author recounts some unique experiences throughout his life, frequently with a touch of humor, recalls memories of his family and treasured friends and relatives, and includes poignant remembrances of some of those who have passed away. The author obviously cherishes California and his hometown of Soquel and loves America, as much of the book is devoted to reflecting on the beauty of his native land, honoring those who contributed to the community and country, either as private citizens or through service in defense of the nation. So from my preface, this book is not an autobiography. If it were, I would have to attempt to deal honestly with the successes and setbacks of my life, the imposter's triumph and disaster of Rudyard Kipling's own death, including their causes, the role fortune played in them, and how I reacted. At age 75, I find that I have no interest in contemplating those matters, much less writing about them. Nor can I imagine any reason why anybody would care to read about them. So that's not what this book is about. Similarly, this book is not an autobiography or biography of my parents, my grandparents, my wife, my brother, or parents-in-law. What this book is about, or its purpose, is more difficult to say. With its title, Writings, Memories, I think I will just have to leave it at that. Okay, and this section is, notes here, so I don't get mixed up. This section is from the chapter on my grandma Izant. According to My Life, My Family, handwritten in 1956 by my grandmother, Ida Folsom Izant, her maternal grandfather, William Davidson, came to California from New York in 1854, and her maternal grandmother, Elizabeth Boyle Davidson, came separately several years later in 1857, by way of the Isthmus, with 5 of her 6 children, one of whom was Emmeline, my grandmother's mother. Emmeline Street in Santa Cruz is named after her. In 1920, Grandpa and Grandma Izant bought a 20-acre farm in Soquel and built their new home in 1932, which they called Silver Birches, where they lived the remainder of their lives. Many of you might remember that, although it's very difficult to recognize now. If you drive up on the other side of Soquel, on Soquel Drive, about a mile on the right-hand side is where their place was. Grandma had been active in the PTA since 1913 in Santa Cruz, and soon after moving to Soquel, she was elected to the Soquel Union School Board in 1922, and then to the Santa Cruz High School Board in 1933, where she remained until she resigned in 1952 at the age of 76, having served Santa Cruz schools in various capacities for 40 years. I skipped this section I meant to read. Grandma didn't note a date when her ancestors first settled in Santa Cruz, but it seems likely that soon after her grandfather arrived in California in 1854. Since her great-great-great-granddaughter Jenny Izant Gonzalez and her husband Javier now live in the Live Oak area, a member of our family has lived continuously in Santa Cruz for 160 years. Jenny, are you here today?
Right here.
Jenny Izant Gonzalez.
Yep.
Lives over on 7th Avenue.
Nice.
And this was sort of on my mother's side of the family. When my great-grandparents Reed retired in 1912, they purchased several acres on Orchard Street in Soquel, where they built a house, sometimes referred to by the family as the old Reed place. My mother once told me, and the Reed place, well, many of you know where Orchard Street is. If you drive up the other side of Soquel, just past Rosedale, you turn right. Orchard Street used to go across the freeway, and now, of course, it ends where the freeway is. And the old Reed place, as you drive down there, there's a mobile home park on the left. The first house on the left which is now kind of shrouded in overgrown shrubbery, is the old Reed place, added on to periodically over the years. My mother once told me that the last time she saw her grandfather, as she boarded a train in Idaho in 1928 for her first teaching job, that her grandfather gave her a $5 gold coin. She said that all the way to Ogden, Utah, and then north to Idaho, she'd check every few minutes to verify that she still had it and hadn't lost it. We've all been there.
Yeah.
I never thought to ask Mom what she did with it, with the coin after she reached her destination. Mom and Dad were married on Saturday, January 30, 1937, in the living room of the home that my father had just completed, and in which they were destined to spend their entire married life. It was on the westerly 2 acres of the property that Dad's parents had bought in 1920, and which had been given to them as an engagement present by his parents. They had a long engagement, long enough for Dad to build a house. The article reprinted here from the Santa Cruz Sentinel News recounts details of Mom and Dad's wedding. Presumably those details reflect those customarily printed by a local newspaper at the time. However, that was not the complete story of their day. It had rained heavily and the ground was saturated. Planks had to be laid down so that the wedding party and guests could reach the front porch without their shoes becoming caked with mud. Perhaps the inclement weather was one reason that apparently no one took any pictures of the ceremony or the reception afterwards. The new home as yet had little landscaping, with only the surrounding orchard may have looked like the photograph below. Mom, with her maid of honor, Margaret Bailey, dressed for the wedding in her future in-laws' home next door. And when it was time for Margaret to drive the car out onto the highway, Old Highway 1 as it was called in Soquel Drive now, for perhaps 100 feet before turning into the muddy driveway of the new home. As Mom would tell the story, Margaret, in a highly excitable mood and probably not paying much of any attention to her driving, turned left right in front of an oncoming truck, causing the driver to swerve up onto the steep bank to avoid a collision and nearly turning over in the process. Well, he climbed out of his truck just mad as a hornet and began berating Margaret up and down one side and the other, going on and lecturing poor old Margaret to pay more attention to what she was doing for something bad really happened. Margaret, being for once at kind of a loss for words and showing what remorse she could under the circumstances and trying somewhat unsuccessfully to defuse the situation, ended up by inviting the man to come to the wedding. All he could do then, Margaret would say, was shake his head, mutter to himself, get back in his truck, and drive away. I once asked my cousin Mary, who was 8 when she attended the wedding, if besides the rain and the mud, anything noteworthy or unusual occurred. Everyone who was there, Mary said, forever remembered that there was a solemn part of the ceremony, and the minister asked your mother and father to kneel on the hearth before him. And then we all tried, with varying degrees of success, to suppress a chuckle, for there on one of the soles of your father's shoes, in big bright chalk letters, was the price of his new shoes. In 1940, there was a fire in Soquel that damaged or destroyed several buildings, including the one in which the hardware store was located. And the proprietor decided not to continue the business. And that was on the other side of the creek from where the Play the Game Sports store is now. This gave Dad an opportunity to cease farm work and go into a retail business. He opened Izant Hardware with a loan from his parents for inventory. In the early years, he didn't have any employees. He just ran the store by himself, 6 days a week. Of course, not open on Sunday like most retail businesses were not then, at least in Soquel. The building that housed the store was owned by Art Grant. I remember my mother telling me that on several occasions when Dad was too ill to run the store, Art would come down, open the store, serve customers, close the store for the day, and refuse any payment. Quite a landlord. Art Graham was a wonderful person. I don't know if there's anybody here that still remembers Art Graham.
Sure.
Rick, do you remember him?
Yes, we do.
Even during the wartime, the store was successful, and Dad was able to pay back the loan within a few years. After his brother Kenneth returned in 1945 from service in the Merchant Marines, the two brothers formed a partnership in February 1946 to become equal partners in the store. With the brothers' partnership and the prosperity that followed at the end of the war and the resulting increase in business, Dad and Ken were able to hire two men who became valuable employees and lifetime friends. I think Howard Fox was the first employee right after the war. He had served overseas with distinction in the Army Air Corps. Charlie Fritz came from Kansas City, where he had been a police officer. The old store, as they like to call it, was too small for the expanding business. And so the brothers built a new store on the west side of Soquel Creek, directly across from the old store. The grand opening was on April 3rd, 1948. The photograph above was taken that evening with each person wearing a corsage. Left to right, Howard and Hermine Fox, Dad and Mom, Ken and Lil, Grandpa and Grandma Izant, Jerry and Charlie Fritz, my brother and I are in front. David? David will now read his essay.
You know, I've enjoyed reading Bert's book a great deal. And even though I've known him for 75 years, I've still learned a few things about him and our family. I'm also flattered that he included some things that I'd written in that book. And so I'm going to read one of those to you today. And it's a fish story. And I was going to embellish it a little bit, but unfortunately Rick Pareto was here. So if I embellish it, he would say, no, that couldn't possibly have happened. Earlier on, you were all asked various questions about who'd done this and who'd done that. I'd be interested in who here fished for steelhead in the Soquel Creek around 1955, other than Rick and myself. And he, okay. Because of my story here, I named the people that I knew that fished. So I didn't leave anybody out intentionally. I left people out who I didn't know at the time. So the title of this is Davy Catches His First Steelhead. Davy was the affectionate name that my mom called me all my life. I never heard her call me Dave. I did hear David a few times when I was in trouble. But aside from those few times, it was always Davy. So anyway, Davy catches his first steelhead. Just as it was becoming too dark to continue fishing on a cold Wednesday afternoon, January 12, 1955, I caught my first steelhead at Soquel Creek. A steelhead is an ocean-going rainbow trout. Mine weighed 8 pounds. I was going to say 16, but Rick was 16-pound steelhead at Soquel Creek at that time. I was 26 inches long. I caught him in a school hole, as it was called in those days. Soquel Creek is aptly named. It rises in the Santa Cruz Mountains and flows fewer than 20 miles before emptying into Monterey Bay. While generally only a trickle in the summertime, the flow of water increases substantially during the rainy season. Moreover, when torrential rains fall in the mountains, Soquel is prone to severe flooding, as occurred in 1940, 1955, and 1982. After the 1982 flood, the bridge in Soquel was replaced with a single span and is envisioned without prevent future flooding, since there is no longer a potential for a log jam forming against the bridge, thus sending a portion of the Santa Creek running through downtown Soquel, as occurred in 1955. Steelhead fishing season is in the winter, when the steelhead return from ocean to spawn. I'd fished Soquel Creek for steelhead for several years and was very unlucky or unskilled, depending on your point of view. It seemed as though everyone caught many fish. I was discouraged, and the fishing community was rooting for me. It was a relatively small community of maybe 15 or so avid fishermen, and we all knew one another. Prominent Soquelites from the 1950s included Ken Izant, my uncle, Charlie Fritz and his son Charles, Mac McFadden, Charlie Mack worked at the hardware store. Others included Eddie Getchman, Johnny Getchman, a local building contractor, Harold Maddock of Maddock's Bakery, Eddie and Valia Pareto, who owned Soquel Variety, and their son Rick, who is here keeping me honest. I was the youngest of the community, as Charles and Rick were several years older than I was. I was fishing that day with Eddie Getchman, who was the auto mechanic in Soquel, who helped me a great deal over the years with my cars. The school hall was behind Soquel Elementary School, and the creek ran generally south and then took a hard turn east. This created a good deep hole with brush on one side and a wide open spit of land on the other. Eddie was fishing on the brush side, and I was on the gravel side. We had been fishing for half an hour or so with no light. All of a sudden, wham, fish on. You always said fish on so that other people would get their lines out of the river and not to tangle you up. And the one time I caught a fish by myself, I still yelled fish on because I just wanted to go through the throat of the thing. There was nobody else in sight. And Eddie, he knew I had a fish, but I loved to let him know for sure. Steelhead are fighters. They swim in one direction and then reverse or jump out of the water, all in an effort to develop slack in the line so they can throw out the hook. The trick is to keep constant tension on the line. I'd seen this many times with other fishermen, so I knew how to proceed. It took me about 5 minutes to tire the fish out. Eddie had waded across the stream to help me, as he did not want to lose my first fish. Because the tricky part landing fish, you have to keep tension on the line while you get it out of the water. So Eddie did the pickup, which might have consisted of reaching down or kicking it out, but anyway, he was very successful at that. I'm sure he was nervous about blowing that opportunity for me. Quite a thrill. My mother took the photograph the next morning. The inscription at the foot is here, and it shows me with the fish here. And if you notice, Kelvin, there's a cat right down here at the bottom, waiting for me to drop the fish or set it or something. Nobody remembers that we ever ate that fish, so I don't know what happened to it. I went on to catch several more fish after that. However, the 1955 Christmas flood greatly disturbed the steelhead run, and I was on to other things. I still fish a little for trout in the Santa Cruz River, but never again the thrill of that first steelhead. And those of you who caught that first steelhead, I don't think will ever forget the thrill of that. It's fun after that, but the first one, I don't know, Rick, do you remember your first steelhead? You caught so many.
Right where Lions Park is now, that's where I got the
Oh,
first
okay, good.
Hey, speaking of the flood, if you look where these birds are, I mean, taxidermy birds, there's a plaque that says where the water came up in 1955
Oh, yeah.
and 1982.
Oh, wow.
My brother and I have made several driving trips around the American West, and there's a section of the book called A Trip Around the American West, where we basically drove 5,000 miles over 3 weeks, and with no plans, we just stopped and see what was interesting. One of our favorite pastimes that my brother and I enjoy, and repeated extensively on this trip, is to go up and down both times of Soquel, as it was in our youth. The hardware store, founded by our father in 1941, being the social center of Soquel in those years. We like to recall each business, the people who own them and work there, their families, and the friendships, and the experiences we had with them. As I remember, there was nobody in Soquel in those days that we did not both know and consider a friend. As you were to descend down into Soquel from the east, before you reached the Congregational Church, on the right where along the gulch there is now an antique shop, was Art Hutchins' refrigeration, repair, and service business. And Art was a classmate of Jerry's and Adele and mine all the way through school when they went here in the 3rd grade. Opposite the church was Henry and Marge Stricker Shopping Bag, grocery store. Any of you that remember Henry and Marge Stricker? Across the street from the hardware store was a building that housed on the left Bill Finn's drugstore, and on the right the medical office of Dr. Carleen and Dr. Anderson. I remember Dr. Carleen making house calls on my brother and me when we were young and sick, and the dental office of Dr. Santos, the town's dentist. And further along on the west side of the main intersection in Soquel was a building containing Arlo Parsons Liquor and Sporting Goods Store and Harley Archibald's Barbershop. Crossing the street and moving eastward, there was Henry Decker's Shoe Store, Maddox Bakery, the County Bank of Santa Cruz, Eddie and Velia's Pareto's Variety Store, Wilbanks Brothers Grocery Store, Charlie Strong's Barber Shop, and the post office where Marion Hobbs was the postmaster. His son is here, Rusty.
Nice.
Beyond the hardware store, on the other side of the bridge over Soquel Creek, was Ralph and Fred Castro's garage and service station. And there were others, many of you will remember others, but those are the ones that I particularly remember. Congregational Church of Soquel was founded in 1868. The sanctuary, the New England style, was designed and built by S.A. Hall, a carpenter who had been a shipbuilder, as evidenced by the fact that the floor sloped noticeably from the center aisle of the sanctuary down each side. The dedication ceremony was August 7th, 1870. A photograph of the Congregational Church, this photograph of the Congregational Church was taken on Palm Sunday, 1951, shortly after my mother became active in the church and my brother and I began attending Sunday school. Mom taught Sunday school in the little room below the pulpit for many years. At first, my brother and I were in her class, and later we were in Mr. Ed Kern's class. The Reverend T. Davis Preston served as minister of the Congregational Church from 1940 until his death early in 1954. He was dedicated to his ministry and much admired by the congregation and the community. Under his direction, and with the assistance of his wife Annie, Camp Sokomo, named for Soquel, Capitola, and Mountain, the community served by the church, was established, which ran for 2 weeks each summer, with a limit of 20 campers a week. The camp had several locations over the years, but when Carol Stone, my brother, and I attended in about 1950 and 51, it was located on Soquel Creek, several miles north of Soquel. If you were to drive up the old San Jose Road, past the two-room mountain schoolhouse on the left, and then turn right at the big clump of eucalyptus trees, and drive down a dirt road, and cross a bridge over the creek. That's where it was. Now, of course, that area is all developed. But then, as Mrs. Preston described in her untitled 283-page biography, written about 1956, quote, "It was a lovely location with a large flat area. And on each side of it, a grove which was used for sleeping quarters, the girls on one side and the boys on the other. There was a lovely beach, the finest on the creek, and each year we dammed up the creek to create a swimming pool. As she later relates, a bulldozer was used at a cost of $25 or $50. The reader may speculate what would happen today. Some of the sections in this book you will see, for those of you who borrow from the library or from my friends, will see that there are some anonymous writers who have contributed to it. And what I'm going to read here from a section called "A Day with Jack in Pine Valley," and it's written by a reporter from the Ventana Wilderness, who wrote it on April 12th, 2005. They facetiously referred to themselves as Ventana 5 dedicated hikers, averaging near the proverbial 70, who apparently like to spend a few days a year together in the wilderness, far enough from the reaches of road and relay stations to escape day hikers and cell phones. The itinerary was to be a 5-day trip, beginning and ending at the Arroyo Seco campground, where the Arroyo Seco River spills out of its gorge into the Salinas Valley. The third night was to be a culmination, a campsite at Pine Ridge Camp, elevation 4,000 feet, affording panoramic views of the rugged mountains, the Big Sur Gorge, and the Pacific Ocean beyond. It had been an unusually wet winter in Northern California. Nevertheless, the Ventana 5 left San Francisco Bay on an April Wednesday early in the new millennium with a long-range weather forecast of showers likely Thursday and Friday, but clearing and sunny on Saturday and Sunday. Right. The 5-day route would take them across Willows Creek, normally a placid rock hopper, a 3-mile hike from their Arroyo Seco campground. Unfortunately, the heavy winter rains had swollen the creek to chest depth, a potentially dangerous crossing, which they sagely decided not to attempt. So back the way they had advanced, they retreated for a net distance of 0 for the first day. But Jacob knew another trail to Pine Ridge. So early the next morning, they drove south on an unpaved Tassajara road and set off again for Pine Ridge Camp. As they crested the first hill, it became cold, with rain accumulating on the ground. And as they descended, it began to rain, not a deluge, just a sharp downpour that, in spite of the hikers' foul weather gear, had them all thoroughly soaked after a couple of hours. Friends, one of the wives back in the Bay Area, taking the weather into condition, was heard to remark, "I don't see why they just didn't check into a motel." Nevertheless, their spirits committed high as they trudged along in the rain. It must have occurred to several of them to wonder how this was going to end. And then a man on a big black horse appeared, saying, "Now when you get to Pine Valley, Jack will have a fire going for you." Well, that was encouraging news to the drenched hikers. But what could it have meant in that wilderness? But on and on they slogged in the rain, drenched to the bone. That's when they arrived at a fork in the trail. Straight ahead and south to Pine Ridge, off to the right and down to Pine Valley. They went right thinking of that fire. Finally, in the early afternoon, they reached Pine Valley. And there they spotted smoke, and then a cabin from whence it came. They walked up, rapped on the door, and Jack English welcomed them. And vindicating the words of the man on the black horse, at the end of the cabin there was a huge fireplace that you nearly could have walked into, with a roaring fire going. Naturally, the hikers availed themselves of Jack's hospitality and began to dry out. And while they did, they heard Jack's story. Jack, a spry and hardy man in his mid-80s, lives life in the cabin on a several-acre parcel in the wilderness that was homesteaded many years ago, and somehow had survived the wilderness designation. Jack built the cabin. Jack built the cabin with all the building materials having been brought in on his back or by wheelbarrow over trail, there being no road within 6 miles. The only exception was the huge cast iron wood-burning stove, which had been brought in by helicopter. He had spent decades in the cabin, most of it with his late wife Mary. But the hikers were soon to learn that Jack had led an eccentric life outside the wilderness, including his stint at gold mining in Alaska. Jack said that nowadays he occasionally spends some time away from the cabin, and when Bert asked him where his hometown was, he said Soquel. And Bert mentioned that he had a classmate at Soquel Elementary and Santa Cruz High School named Madeline English. And Jack responded, that was his niece. And when Bert asked Jack where in Soquel he lived, he said, quote, as far up Rodeo Gulch as you can go. To which Bert responded, quote, then you must have known the Locatellis, unquote. And Jack said, quote, I hunted deer with all of them. Diane was the brunette, and Jerry, another of Bert's classmates, was the blonde. Diane and Jerry are both here today. That includes one of the prepared readings I have. There are a number of chapters in the book that I didn't even mention. I was talking to Jerry Walters early, and I mentioned there's a chapter in here called 20 Lieutenants. Jerry and I were both in ROTC programs. Jerry at UC Santa Barbara, and I at UC Berkeley. Those of you that have interest in the military might enjoy that chapter. There's a chapter on golf, and if you are golfers, or if unfortunately you're a hacker like I am, you might enjoy some of the stories in that chapter. There's a chapter on remembrances, which includes eulogies that I've given in some more memorial services over the years, particularly one service at sea that David and I, my late Uncle Ken, Jenny's father, the three of us conducted for Jenny's grandfather, who was a partner with me at a hardware store. And finally, the final section of the book is on a friend, not a friend, but a person whom I met whose son was killed in Afghanistan about 10 years ago. And she happened to be featured on a program on 60 Minutes about a year and a half ago. It was re-shown last fall on 9/11, which is a yearly memorial service that occurs at the Marines Memorial Building in San Francisco, honoring all California servicemen who have been killed in the war since 9/11. So those are some of the other, there's a chapter on my wife's parents who led a very interesting life with a tremendous amount of humor. There's more humor in that section on Charlie and Louise, including my attempts at pie making, than there perhaps is in any other section of the book. So various sections will be of interest to various people. Anybody that borrows the book, you don't need to really start reading on page 1. You can just open it and jump around it. So glad to take questions or comments or anything.
Who won the pennant in 1912?
Well, I think the New York Giants won in the American League. Boy, that was the time that Pittsburgh had. Red Sox might have won in 12. Not sure, but I would have known that in 1955.
I'm curious if you can tell me anything about the Millsap family.
I remember the name, but I can't say that I remember anything specific about the Millsap.
Bucky Millsap,
Yes.
Yeah, I
very
can.
successful commercial artist in San Diego area. You see his work in museums. in
Yeah.
San Diego. The
I
Aircraft Museum, he did a series of portraits of early airplane pilots. You'll recognize him by the eyes, very distinct eyes that Bucky drew. His name was really Darrell,
yeah.
okay?
Thank you.
Dick, did you have something else to add? Someone else over here said?
Well, his sister Pat married Bob Grossi. I think she still lives in Santa Cruz.
Oh, thank you.
There's a section in here called Mother's Friendships. Do any of you remember a young man named Danny Ambrose?
Yeah.
Well, and you would particularly like to read the section in here which begins on page 61 about what Danny Ambrose did in 1976.
Was that the Donkey Burrow
Yes, it is.
Kenny Museum? Yeah.
Yes. Those of you who don't remember, American Centennial, only 10 years away, there was a challenge for another enterprising and dedicated young American to try to match Danny Ambrose's inspirational achievement. Yes.
Did you, from your mother or grandmother, get any information about what Soquel was like in the 1880s, 90s? Was it
Well,
Felicia's
our
village?
family's first contact in Soquel was when my mother's grandparents bought the place on Orchard Street in 1912.
Oh, okay. So before that, they lived in
He was
Santa
a-
Cruz?
He was a retired Civil War veteran. We're very proud of that. Very active in the, I forget offhand the name of the organization. So on my mother's side, that was the first contact with Soquel. On my father's side was when my grandparents moved to Soquel from a little home on Ocean Street in 1920.
But before that, they were in Santa Cruz, and you said you had a great-grandfather who arrived in 1854.
Yes, so that family was in Santa Cruz. There was a home on Button Street. And then there was another home on, that a branch of the family lived on Blaine. And know Santa Cruz like Jerry does, they're not too far away from where Jerry lives.
There were gardens that
Yeah, I mean,
area then.
it recites in here that the place that the Folsom family settled on Button Street, I think the deed says over 5 acres, so probably extended sort of north toward the mountains that later on would have become subdivided.
You didn't mention anything about law enforcement in SoCal.
Wasn't it?
We were pretty well behaved then, you know, occasional prank or two. So I don't remember very much about law enforcement. Certainly remember a lot about the volunteer fire department. I know that Ken was very active in that. Ken and Ray Negro, I think, were most active there, but most every able-bodied male in Soquel, when that fire alarm went off, everybody raced to the fire station. It was about where it is now. You know, get there as fast as you could.
Do you have any photographs of the first hardware store, that block of stores that Art Graham owned?
Yes, there is a photograph.
We did a book about the history of Soquel recently, maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't recently. But we had a hard time trying to find any photographs of the east side of the bridge.
There's one photograph in the book. I probably can't find it without fumbling around it now. There is a photograph of it, and there's a photograph of the inside of that hardware store. But that doesn't tell you very much about the outside. I can dimly remember it, so I would have been 6 when the new store was built.
In the flood of '55, was the hardware store damaged?
I'm sorry?
In the flood of '55, was the hardware store damaged?
Well, I remember the flood of '55 distinctly. My brother was sick that night, so he was not there. But the river came up. Everybody knew that the river was coming up, and about, I would say in the afternoon, the logs started forming against the bridge on the pier toward the west. And it had been raining hard in the mountains. I mean, what causes a flood in Soquel then and now is when it rains 20 inches or maybe 10 or 15 inches up in the mountains, and it doesn't take more than several hours before the floodwaters come down. So by mid-evening, 8 or 9 o'clock, the water had backed up and was running through downtown Soquel. And at the south end of the hardware store, since there had been a flood in 1940, so everybody knew that flooding was a problem, was a danger. There was an area where we had a bulkhead, and you could keep putting sort of big 2x6s on it. We had pumps that were going, and eventually we were standing there back at the hardware store, and the water was up here, and somebody said, you know, maybe it's time to leave. which we then did, by which time the water was going through downtown Soquel right toward the Pareto's place, because that's where the main current was at that point in time. So the water came up about, as I recall, about 3 feet on the first floor. And by the next morning when we came back, I mean, the creek was all down. It wasn't, I won't say it was a trickle then, but it had stopped raining during the night, and all it left was awful mud everywhere, which anybody who was here could remember. I mean, the mud in the basement of the store after the water was pumped out, I mean, the mud was that deep, because so much mud and logging to the really came down.
I have a picture of my ex-husband and his brother and his family, because they lived in Soquel at the time, just not too far up the road, and coming down the creek in a rowboat.
We didn't take any pictures that night. Pretty vivid, but still pretty vivid in my memory.
Yeah, the water went through the Wilbanks Brothers grocery store, and in the Fred Billiatuni's butcher shop, and washed the butcher block out into the ocean, and I picked it up off of New Brighton Beach, and back, and it had one leg missing.
And because the Wilbanks
So Rick,
store,
were you born then?
Oh, I remember you doing it.
the center of town, Wilbanks store and the variety store is probably 4 or 5 feet lower than the hardware store. So if the water was 3 feet in the hardware store, it must have been 7 or 8 feet in the variety store. Would that be about right, Rick?
turned over the counters and floated into the back of the store. And we didn't get out until the next day. We were stuck in it all night.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Who ran the variety store?
The variety store. Rick's parents did.
Who? The variety store?
Yeah, yeah.
The Ugly Mug?
The ugly mug.
What was the name of it?
The Soquel variety store. Soquel 5 and Dime.
Soquel 5 and Dime.
Well, thank you all for,
Are there other memories that you all want to recall, or any questions that you want to ask? I think you haven't had a chance. Your turn.
I actually have a story that you two can verify that was told to me by my mother, who you worked for, Roy and Pat Morgan.
Oh,
Sure.
Up North Main Street. Grew, well, there was an orchard, but they were experimenting with zucchini. And they needed pickers. And of course, the source for labor was the local kids. And you came to work for them. And my mom recalls you as being very serious, dedicated, you know, top-notch workers. But this was a new crop. They sent you out with instructions out to the field with boxes to cut zucchini with a knife. And she said, as Mom tells the story, that you were a long time in coming back, kind of unusual, thought that would maybe be a little quicker than that. So finally you came in with your box full of zucchini that was all diced up. So you took the instructions, you know, literally cut the zucchini the way you knew how, was to cut it up. Now, do you recall that?
no, but what I do recall was picking raspberries.
Yeah, well, of course, that was the main crop, yeah.
That I distinctly recall. And during that period of time, I was about 8 or 9 until 13 or 14. I picked raspberries and strawberries and blackberries in 8 or 10 different places around. I was a pretty assiduous berry picker in those days.
And Dave remembers it.
I remember the raspberries. I do not remember the zucchini.
Well, you did pick raspberries. They remember you picking raspberries for us. And so you were hired on right away for the zucchini. But that was the funny story that they
Get fired right up. That was
Oh,
the
of course
last.
not. Everybody deserves a second chance.
There's a question back here in the back.
Just, if I need to run, I'm so sorry I do, but I would like to tell a brief story because I think it epitomizes the heart of the Izants, and that is, I'm Laura Hamby at Soquel Church, and Gladys was the clerk there for years when I was growing up and when I was a youth, and I often kind of consider her a bit of a mentor. I used to have a window washing business, and I would go wash the windows in her home and do other miscellaneous things. But one of my favorite stories she would tell, we would talk about the flood, and she said, oh dear, and she would kind of pant a little, the way Gladys would when she wanted to say something that she didn't want to offend anybody with. And she said, well, you know, we were one of the few, maybe the only business, and I don't know other business, so I can't speak to that was insured. And so when everything got all cleaned up, and the insurance had paid us off, all of our stuff that it was harmed, which was most things, was in the basement. And this is the way I recall the story, so you know I can't verify this. But she said everybody in town was having flood sales and selling things off incredibly inexpensively and very cheap. And the townspeople were quite upset with us that we weren't having a flood sale. And we didn't want to say anything, or we couldn't explain why, because we didn't want to flaunt the fact that we had insurance, but all of those goods now belong to the insurance company. And I thought that was just a very sweet story of how they just kind of took the heat for the situation and didn't say anything about the insurance. And just one quick flood story on the heels of that. I went to school with the Kenyon girls who their mother was a Wilbanks. And when I was going to school with them through the 60s, they were still wearing Levi's that had no orange threads on them because they were all turned blue, and the little Levi tag in the back was all blue from having been in the store, because they were being sold at the store and they were still leftover flood pants. But anyway, it's an honor, and I'm very sorry I need to run.
There was one more hand up over here. Oh, yes, you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this. I wonder if you can talk about, a little bit you've talked already about the agriculture that was in the area. I'd like to hear more about that, maybe logging, and a popular topic of today is traffic. What was the traffic like back then?
A lot more bicycles there, although bicycles are coming back. Agriculture, I was only aware of who had berry patches and I didn't know. My brother had different experience with agriculture.
I worked on a flower ranch for about 5 years, and Rich Thompson's dad, who I always called as Red Thompson, I don't think that was his real name, but I worked for him for about 4 or 5 years, my first real job. And I remember that originally I was paid 25 cents an hour. And back then, that wasn't bad money. It was hard work. It was probably my most memorable job. I don't know how many of you remember Red Thompson. If you know Rich, you probably have some idea of what it was for. A very, very colorful person. I learned a lot of things from him. I learned a lot of 4-letter words from him. But it was just probably the best first job that I could have imagined. It was much better than picking berries. I did not like picking berries. Bert was a master. But, with hard work, picking flowers and cultivating and all those things, and doing some mechanic work around his tractors and all that. So I appreciate what your dad taught me so very much.
Yes, Judy.
It occurs to me that so many of you may have pictures of Soquel. The Soquel Pioneers are working on a website to preserve pictures of Soquel. And we have hundreds of them in our archive, but we're very open to having more. And if you want your picture preserved, and you still get to keep your picture, we would love to have it. And the way to do that is to see me after the meeting, and I'll give you my email address.
This is Judy Parsons. She's president of the Soquel Pioneers and Historical Society. So she's a couple of you had some historical questions that I couldn't answer. She's the person to go to with those questions. Sure. Are there some other comments or, no? No? Okay. Thank you all so much for coming.